Hi, this is Christopher Perrin, and welcome to this episode of the Christopher Perrin Show. In this episode, I would like to talk again about virtue. Virtue, what is it? It's a key word in the history of education, and it's actually a key word in, well, the history of humanity. But it's not a word that is easily understood and that we can easily define, at least not in this cultural moment. If you were to ask a friend, what is virtue? How do you think he or she would respond? Just think about your circle of friends, maybe acquaintances, maybe a neighbor, maybe a colleague. So what do you think virtue is? You probably will get a furrowed brow and maybe a response like this. Well, why do you ask? Or what do you mean? Why is this important to you? Or what do you think virtue is? But it's a word that's been stretched and thinned. So we don't really typically have a clear answer for this question. We might talk about virtue signaling. We use this phrase. We might talk about virtual reality. And maybe we've heard some maxims from the past that still rattle around in the back of our heads. Maxims like, well, virtue is its own reward. You heard that? Or there's no virtue in necessity. But what is virtue? Perhaps you might even recall some ways that we poke fun at virtue. Oscar Wilde did, and others like him. Oscar Wilde says, I can resist anything except temptation. He's here speaking about vice, which is virtue's opposite, and we have trouble defining vice too. He also remarks about someone that he hasn't a single redeeming vice. And the bad boy of Baltimore, H.L. Mencken, says somewhere, a virtuous man is merely one who hasn't had the occasion to be otherwise. So I think we're confused about what virtue is and what vice is for at least two reasons. First, there is a long tradition and a sustained conversation about virtue and its importance. And secondly, we are ignorant of that tradition and conversation, and hence our confusion. It's another way of saying we're not very well educated and we're generally ignorant. But in the case of this, in the case of, say, defining virtue, we don't know what we don't know. Sure, we know the word, and sure, we have a vague general sense that comes to mind when we hear the word virtue, and maybe we do think that we know what it is until someone asks us to define it. Isn't this true of you? It probably is. Let's do a little test, for example. Imagine, for example, that you're on a podcast with someone and you're being interviewed, and someone says, "So, could you please just give the audience a definition of virtue? What is it? What is virtue?" Pause for a moment. How would you answer? What are you thinking of now? I think probably the majority of you, if you were like me, aren't sure you can come up with a good, clear answer. You might mumble a bit. Augustine says this about time, but it's a different kind of case. He had thought a lot about time. This is in Book 11 of his Confessions. But he says, I know what time is until you ask me to define it. Well, virtue might be that way. You have a sense of what it is until you're asked to talk about it. And if this doesn't humble you, try this example. Try naming the liberal arts. Can you name them? You know, there's more than one, otherwise we wouldn't use the plural. Now, if you've been following this podcast and you're involved in classical education, I bet you can do pretty well. But can you name all 7 of the traditional liberal arts? The Septem Artes Liberales? Well, if you can name them, and some of you are rattling them off in your head, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the verbal arts, sometimes called the trivium, the threefold path, and then the mathematical arts, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Astronomy now similar to very much physics. Those were the quadrivium arts, the fourfold path, the arts of number. So you have the arts of word, the arts of number. Those are the 7 liberal arts. But then try answering these questions. Why are they called liberal? And then, of course, the follow-up question is, why are they called arts? Why aren't they called sciences? Why aren't they called disciplines or just subjects? What does it mean that we would say they are arts? If you think I'm tempted to boast about this because I now know the answers to these questions, don't think that way, because I was 35 years old, a new headmaster at a classical school in Pennsylvania, asking myself these questions and realizing that even as a head of school, I could not answer these questions. So I was 35 before I did the study and talked to friends until I could come up with some decent answers to these questions, because I too was ignorant of the tradition. I was a classics minor in college. I had studied Latin and Greek, but I still did not know much about what classical education was. So this is the common predicament of educated Americans who think that they are educated when in fact they are not. By the way, if you think you're educated, that's already a problem, because the people who are well educated are more aware of their ignorance than their knowledge. Because, the circumference of what you know increases the boundary of what you don't know. And so humility should increase with knowledge, but often it doesn't. So the educated person is always somebody else. It's someone you admire. And then if you interview that person and get to know that person, you'll discover that he doesn't view, or she doesn't view, herself as well educated. This is Mark Van Doren writing in his book Liberal Education. Mark Van Doren was a professor at Columbia University. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. He wrote a book called Liberal Education, and he says this very thing. This is true of the tradition of classical education. Just like Socrates. Socrates was wise because he was aware of his ignorance. But that's the problem. The opposite problem is what Americans often have. We're not aware of our ignorance, and we're too proud of what we know. Professors at liberal arts colleges, in my experience anyway, usually cannot name the liberal arts. They will typically, can you name the liberal arts? I think you can now. But often professors will say, and this is a very small sampling of my experience, but when I've asked them, they'll cite literature, history, philosophy, political science, possibly theology, but none of these were the traditional 7 liberal arts. They are playgrounds. They're disciplines in which the liberal arts are necessary, but they are not the liberal arts. So how is it that you can go to a liberal arts college and be taught by liberal arts professors and still not be able to name the liberal arts? Well, it says something about where we've come. If these professors can't name the liberal arts, are they teaching us the liberal arts? How can they cultivate virtue within us if we can't define virtue and we can't define the liberal arts? Maybe it's happening, but seems to me it would be happening without us really being clearly aware of whether or not it is. The good news is that good things still do happen in college classes with good professors. But I maintain that we have lost our vocabulary for clearly describing what good education is. In fact, even the word education suffers from this problem. We have to use modifiers now in front of the word education to describe what we're doing, because we no longer have a consensus about what education is. So we might have vocational education. We might have technical education. We might have classical education. We might have scientific education. We might have an education in manners. We have all kinds of educations. But it used to be that the word education was understood before about 1900. I often say that we could recover the entire classical tradition of education simply by the method of revisiting and redefining our educational vocabulary, educational words. And we should start with, of course, the word education. And I have written about this. I think I've talked about it on some podcasts. I have a Substack article on, I have 2 or 3 of them, on recovering a vocabulary for education. And you can find those at christopherperrin.substack.com. Virtue comes from the Latin word virtus. Virtus, or if you're using the classical pronunciation, virtus. Virtus is related to the Latin word vir, which means man. Someone, therefore, with virtus was a man come into his own, an idealized man, a man who had become a man. Certainly he was courageous and brave. Virtus could mean that. But he was a man as we would hope a man could be. And this ideal and idea lives in our word virtuoso. Virtuoso. It's someone who is supremely excellent at some skill, like playing the violin. Virtue, then, is human excellence of any kind, from fighting a battle to playing a violin. If it's human excellence, well then, there are a lot of ways in which humans can be excellent. And so the word virtus could mean lots of different virtues, lots of different ways in which humans could excel at being excellent, at being good in any area that is of human enterprise. From culinary excellence to military excellence, to moral excellence, civic excellence, academic excellence, and even spiritual excellence. The Greek word for virtus is aretē. And interestingly, to those of you in the Christian tradition, the Apostle Paul uses the Greek word aretē for virtue in Philippians 4, where he writes, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent," and here he uses the word aretē, "if anything is aretē or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you." So in the Latin, the translation in the Latin Vulgate, it's virtus. Aretē, virtus. Aretē, the Greek, virtus, the Latin. When Paul was writing to the Philippians, the word and concept of virtue, or aretē, was already well known and had been reflected upon for well over, 700 years, going back to Homer publishing the Iliad and the Odyssey, where we see aretē there, and then following up with, Plato and Aristotle. And even in the Old Testament, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is the Septuagint uses the word aretē 6 times. For example, we find it in Isaiah 43, when the Lord says, "I have formed these people, and they will declare my virtues," or my virtue. So God himself is understood to have supreme excellence, and in the Christian and Jewish tradition, we are to try, with God's grace and help, to be like God, and therefore to have a kind of excellence, because after all, we're made, designed in the image and likeness of God, and we're called to be like him. "Be holy as I am holy," we read in the scriptures. Well, if humans can be excellent in so many various ways, it's no surprise that over the centuries, we humans have classified the various ways that we can be excellent. The tradition, beginning with Homer, Plato, and Aristotle, lists 4 universal, overarching, keystone virtues that every human being should possess if they're going to be morally excellent. And these 4 key virtues were prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. Fortitude also called courage. And these were called, in the Latin tradition, cardinal virtues. Cardinal from the Latin word for hinge, which is cardo, cardinus. So these are the virtues on which your life would swing or revolve like a door on a hinge. These were hinge virtues. So now that we're talking, you'll see that we're not just talking about virtue in the singular. We're already talking about 4 virtues. So we have virtue in this larger, universal, abstract sense, but we have many virtues. Moral virtues describe the way we human beings develop habits of behavior in relation to other human beings, thus making up the mores. You know that phrase, the mores of a culture? Well, this is where we derive the word moral. The morals, the customs, the habits, the ways of being in a culture, those are the mores. And so these moral virtues have to do with how we live well in society and live together. But not only are there moral virtues, we have classified virtues that are virtues of learning, and they've typically been called intellectual virtues, but we could call them academic virtues or educational virtues. Can such virtues be developed or cultivated? This tradition says, yes, we can cultivate these virtues. We can create habits of being that are good for being a moral citizen in relationship to others, but also being a good student. And the cultivation of these virtues is always a cooperative effort. Certainly, it is in education. Education, teaching and learning, is a cooperative art. Think about it. If a student, for various reasons, decides to dig in his heels and not learn, how easy is it to teach? You really can't teach a student until that student has decided he wants to learn and to learn for himself. No one grows virtuous in isolation. We all need models, teachers, parents, even fellow students who can inspire us. We also have to respond, act, and work. And not surprisingly, humans have also discovered that there is a class of virtues, therefore, that is particular to studying and learning. And we've come up with names for these. We usually call them intellectual virtues. If anyone would be a good student, there are various habits of excellence he ought to acquire, and of course, vices to avoid. And these virtues would include wonder, zeal, humility, diligence, attentiveness, discipline, courage, that is academic courage, and temperance, that is academic temperance, modulating our study. If you're an educator, do your students have these traits? Would you like it if they did? Do you have these traits such that they can be inspired by you and imitate you? Here's what surprised me as a 35-year-old headmaster. Education is the cultivation of virtue. Now, there's some other definitions that we could use, but this is a high-level and true definition, true to the tradition. Education is the cultivation of virtue, both the moral and intellectual virtues, and we could add, however, the civic virtues, the spiritual virtues, and even the physical virtues. And you might be wondering, well, what are the civic virtues? What are the physical virtues? What are the spiritual virtues? Well, I bet most of you know them, but the cardinal virtues live everywhere. Cardinal virtues are moral virtues, but they can also be academic virtues. They can be civic virtues. But in terms of living in society together, we need courage, responsibility, civic mindedness, honesty, care, loyalty, generosity. These would be some of the common civic virtues. And then the physical virtues, that would include speed or swiftness, strength, endurance, agility or coordination, grace, and health. And the spiritual virtues from the Christian tradition are faith, hope, and love. Paul saying in 1 Corinthians 13 that the greatest of these is love. So, education will involve the cultivation of virtue. When people, say before around about 1900, heard the word education, that's what would register in their minds. The cultivation and development of human virtue. Sometimes we'll call this the cultivation of a human being or humanity. This is where we get the word the humanities, humane learning, humane letters. These are things that make you more human, help you to grow in virtue. In fact, one of the Latin words for education, in addition to educatio, was simply the word humanitas. Humanitas meant education, education in virtue, human formation. These concepts don't quickly come to our mind, do they, when we think about sending our children to school or getting an education. Education back before, say, 1900, which was the beginning, say, of the Progressive Revolution, including the progressive revolution in education that usurped the old way of education, which we now sometimes call classical. Education back then was formation of a human being, a human soul, formation in virtue. And sometimes people would add wisdom to virtue. Another word for prudence sometimes in some contexts. And sometimes educators and writers of education would add eloquence as well. In other words, the goal of education, the purpose of education, or what is education? It's education leading to virtue, wisdom, and eloquence. And why eloquence? Well, because eloquence describes what happens to a person at the end of a good education. They become morally good and able to express themselves well, the good man speaking well. And so eloquence becomes a kind of consummate expression that you find in a formed human being. So these were the chief and clear ends of an education. Well, now that we are learning a bit about what education is and used to be, don't you want it for yourself and for your own children? I sure do. Well, as a postscript, I'll just note that Carrie Eben and I have just finished a book called The Good Teacher, 10 Key Pedagogical Principles that will transform your teaching. And in this book, we have a chapter, an introductory chapter on education as virtue, and then it kind of permeates and pervades the entire book as we discuss these other principles of what it means to do good teaching. But we gathered together a list of the academic virtues that I think might be helpful, and you can find this in a Substack article as well, the Substack article that's entitled V is for Virtue. But here are the intellectual or academic virtues with a brief definition. First, love and wonder. This is gratitude to be in the world and a spirit of wonder and admiration for the cosmos. You can't really be a good student without having wonder, being at wonder in the cosmos, and we need to cultivate that among our students. Studium, zeal and inquisitiveness. Now, these are all synonyms. Studium is a Latin word that essentially means the zeal to know, and kind of what we might call a healthy spirit of curiosity about how the world works. And then thirdly, humility and docility, which is a recognition of one's ignorance, and a willingness and a desire to be taught by those who know more than we do. And that's docility means this desire to be taught, a willingness to be taught, openness to being taught, a hunger. And then diligence or constancy, which is a love-compelled study that stays on task and resists distraction. The word diligence is actually related to a word which means to love. So if you love something, you will stay with that thing. You will study what you love. That's diligence. Attentiveness. Every good student needs to learn to be attentive, and that's propelled by a thirst, like studium, to know something true, good, and beautiful. And as that thirst propels the student to stretch out, to grasp and know and possess. And at the root of the word attendere in Latin, attention, is this word the tension is related to this. It's a stretching out. That's attention. And then discipline or thoroughness, which is a disposition and habit to do work carefully and to do it all the way to its conclusion. Courage and tenacity, which is the disposition to face academic difficulties that may at first be daunting, and then to overcome them with perseverance and necessary help. And then temperance, one of the cardinal virtues that also lives as an academic virtue. It's the moderated, prudent use of time and energy to do academic work, neither understudying or overstudying. And then finally, responsibility. And this is the disposition that realizes that all deep learning must be done by the student who decides to learn for herself and to cooperate with her teachers. I hope that's been helpful to you. I hope it will propel you to do some more contemplation of virtue as education and education as virtue. And as always, I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you for watching or viewing. I'd like to thank you for watching or listening to the Christopher Perrin Show. And to do that, I can give you a coupon code that will give you 10% off on anything that you might care to order at classicalacademicpress.com. And the coupon code is simply CP Show. Thanks again for listening or watching.